welcome. And I hope today you'll get to take away some nuggets from this presentation that will spur further discussions in your own professional and personal lives. I'm going to pivot now gracefully just to talk about our tech. By now, 3 years in, I think we're all pretty familiar with Zoom, but I'm still going to run through a couple of things. We have a number of polls set up to gauge who's in the room and how you felt about the session. These are going to be posted at the beginning as well as at the end. I'm going to be your presenter and moderator. My name again is Akua. And after I present, I'll be hosting a discussion with 2 guest speakers. You'll have a chance throughout to post questions in the Q&A, and we encourage you to do so as they come to mind. We'll also use that sort of platform as a way to upvote questions so that when we come to the time where we can focus on discussion, we can prioritize those questions that have the greatest level of interest from participants on this call. So moving ahead, I do want to introduce our other guest speakers for today. So Tamara White is our Associate Executive Director for Small Housing BC, and she's a planner and affordable housing specialist. She has a strong background in community-based development and has conducted extensive research on policy and policy analysis, holding roles in government as well as in planning agencies in Brazil, China, and Canada. Her work spans the housing spectrum from homelessness through to affordable home ownership. And Tamara's work in BC is really focused on scaling up and enhancing the impact of gentle density solutions. Jake is a co-founder of Small Housing BC and our current board member. He's also founder and principal of SmallWorks, which is an infill housing design development company that's built over 300 laneway homes. A compassionate voice for more housing options in single-family neighborhoods. He became a really strong advocate in the early noughts for coach homes and laneway houses, and worked with the City of Vancouver to introduce the program in 2009 that has led to thousands of developments of laneway homes. He's also subsequently supported policy amendments in dozens of jurisdictions across the province. So that's a little bit about us. And now we really want to get to know you. So we're going to post a poll that is going to have you determine what professional background you're coming to this call from, as well as where in the province or outside of the province you're joining us from. So if we can get that poll up. Give you a chance or two to read through them and select that. And I'll see maybe Ina or Jada in the background. When you're ready to post the results, you let me know. Make sure you click in about where you're coming from. So right now we've got definitely most folks are planners who are coming to this, which is excellent. We do have people who are also government employees and elected officials. Of course, kind of the whole suite includes, you know, builders, designers, and nonprofit organizations. So welcome and great to see such a good diversity on the call. We're going to move on to also just see where you are located. So the next poll is going to help us get a sense of that. We can put up the next poll. We're sharing it just now. All right. Do folks see the are we able to see the results from the location? Sorry, I think I may have closed it, so we may not be able to have that just yet.
I can jump in here, Akua, and just note that about a third of our participants are coming in from Vancouver Island, a third from Southwest BC, and then a smattering from other areas throughout the province. Thanks everyone for participating in the poll.
Great, fabulous. Okay, well, really, this is a whole session that's going to be speaking to you about small housing, which is maybe synonymous with the term gentle density, and also what you may have heard of as missing middle or missing little. And we know that there's been a really significant movement towards this, especially in the last several years. Increasingly so, we actually see some changes at the provincial level that have further enforced the sense that the popularity or interest in infill housing and single detached neighborhoods is gaining steam. And so this is part of, or a sampling of, the Premier's proposed housing plan that he really, when he was seeking to become Premier, put forward. This was included, legalizing secondary suites across the board, allowing up to 3 homes per lot in our urban centers, really ensuring that there were municipal housing production targets, so that the supply of housing options would be increased, and reforming kind of municipal approval processes to support those. Small Housing BC as an organization really focuses on catalyzing the evolution of single detached neighborhoods and those ground-oriented homes, ensuring that really we have a greater level of access to housing options for British Columbians. Our organization has been around for a little over a decade now, but has played a more substantive role in the last couple of years. Our work includes advocacy, so that is, like you'll learn today, developing policy and regulatory proposals that we believe are important to advance this type of housing, conducting research and collating that to find and seek out best practices about how we go about putting in place gentle density solutions, building the capacity of the industry as well as the planning community to be able to support this type of developments, and model development. So when we talk about model development, it's not necessarily just housing archetypes, but rather what are the kind of proformas that need to be in place in order to ensure greater levels of affordability and feasibility for these housing options. And when you look at what we're really trying to tackle here, is we're addressing, we're looking at the challenges of our time. So growing population, housing affordability at a really acute level, the climate imperative, addressing equity and access for more marginalized communities in the face of more strained municipal budgets, and changing interests about where households, community members, the public want to be. So what really are the typologies that we are explicitly looking at? It's not necessarily just the typologies, actually. It really is this form of development that's typically led by a homeowner. So whereas we're most commonly used to housing supply being developed by private sector industry, this type of housing can't take place without the involvement, or most commonly the involvement of a homeowner, which makes it quite a distinct form of housing. And the types of housing that, I'll just put a smattering here, but this is not by no means a whole extensive list, but it includes laneway houses or coach homes, pocket neighborhoods, co-housing, house plexes where you'll have multiple units that appear to be a house from the outside, tiny homes, small lot homes, which are akin to townhomes but have a distinct separation and strata title, grow homes, which came from the east, and secondary suites as an example. So with all this range of housing typologies, we really sought to find what are the key recommendations in this moment of time that we think are going to be critical to accelerate the adoption of gentle density solutions in our province. We know that this is a moment where the province has really prioritized housing and the increase in housing supply. We feel that gentle density housing options are a critical component of that solution. So these recommendations were developed over the last year to help inform some of the decisions being made, both at the local level, but primarily at the provincial level. So the three recommendations that we've put forward are really intended to unlock the potential of homeowner developers to contribute housing options in typically more uniform single-detached neighborhoods. It is to enable strata-title of accessory dwelling units. It's to develop a province-wide gentle density housing mechanism. And third, to utilize the permanently attainable home ownership model, which we've developed to increase the amount of more attainable housing options within single detached neighborhoods. So let's look at these ones a little more closely. Currently, most programs for laneway homes and coach houses or garden suites don't allow for stratification. This is really done more deliberately to enable rental housing stock and to prevent the perception that strata-title is going to empower a whole speculators market. But what we find, though, is that this approach continues to limit the uptake on programs and still concentrate actually wealth in the original homeowner. So many individuals can see a path to downsizing if they were able to sell off, for instance, a portion of their property. And this type of mechanism helps to create a first-time homeowner option, which currently doesn't necessarily exist in those types of neighborhoods. In fact, stratification is crucial to ensuring that small holders are going to become developers of their properties. It can be a key piece for financing, for enabling more multi-generational household arrangements, and it also supports and protects even unrelated households to sharing land. So while homeowners consider developing, while this type of allowance would enable homeowners to develop their property, it doesn't necessarily preclude them from keeping it as rental tenure. So you'll likely, and we see this in examples elsewhere, you will still end up with a mix. We also find that it can actually mitigate a speculator's market because stratification doesn't occur until the completion of construction of a new infill unit. On bare land developments, housing agreements can be put in place to mitigate any speculative activity. We did some research in Victoria and looked at the land lift that would result from strata-title and found that it was insufficient to sort of generate that widespread speculation. So this is one piece that we sort of see as critical to enabling gentle density. A second is really this idea of developing a province-wide gentle density housing mechanism. So what we see emerging today are kind of two trajectories. There is the move by many local governments to enable greater levels of gentle density, putting in place bylaw amendments that allow this. But in other instances, we're also seeing limited uptake because of conditions around kind of parking requirements, land size, usage, setbacks, and so forth. So a province-wide a gentle density mechanism removes the ability of governments to inhibit certain types of development. In fact, it's an approach that would be as of right, that you would be allowed to develop certain properties on your lot. In the case that we've created here, it's more akin to a tiered approach. So like you may be more familiar with the step code. So where a step one might be to implement the legalization of all accessory dwelling units. Step 4 would be authorizing sixplexes. A tiered approach allows a local government to select that tier that best suits the needs and their own housing goals, but at the same time creates a baseline that jurisdictions would work to enable in their communities. Now, this is not unusual. This has been done elsewhere, and we can look to the south to see examples that have taken place in California, in Oregon, and Washington, where through the last I'd say just over a decade, we've seen significant changes in the policy landscape to enable accessory dwelling units in these states. So, for example, some of the trajectory of the Oregon's move towards this was early in the noughts to ban exclusive use of single-family zoning in cities. That was a first step. It didn't necessarily go as far as it didn't impact necessarily housing production in the way that they sought. So they also then created kind of actions to facilitate housing production and enabling ADUs essentially putting in place clear objective standards that would enable those. And lastly, what they've done is actually leaned in further to create land divisions for missing middle housing. These were all policies that were enacted at the state level. When you look at how the impact of these types of policies took place or took root in the states, they're really quite significant. So in California, for example, in 2015, before they passed statewide legislation allowing ADUs by right, in 2015, there were 500 permits issued for ADUs. Between 2018 and 2021, there were 53,500 ADUs permitted in California. This came from all kinds of neighborhoods, rural, urban, wealthy, low income. It also, in the last 2 years, resulted in $100 million in financing that was made available for the development of ADUs, and a $4 billion industry that built up around it. So it's clear that examples from this, from our communities to the south of us, have really demonstrated what type of impact these more statewide, province-wide initiatives can have on housing developments. And lastly, we have a recommendation really around, I would say, more affordable or attainable housing. So this is to utilize the permanently attainable home ownership model. So we know that even with greater number of options of housing, that by allowing a wider variety of gentle density solutions, many of those housing options are still going to remain unaffordable for a large portion of households. So we have to put in place a tactic that allows us to start to address this. We know that affordable housing models have been applied within higher density developments, and that's typically where they are located. There are very, very few examples of below market housing within single detached neighborhoods. And so this is really a focus of Small Housing BC, is to look at ways that we enable that. The way that we can enable that, we have found, is by allowing a multiplex development. So, for instance, most jurisdictions in the province, if you were to build 4 to 6 units on a lot, though one of those units could be held below market value in perpetuity through a negative covenant that's registered on title. This is the type of result that you could receive without government intervention. This unit could be managed by a nonprofit housing provider or another social housing entity and that is able to kind of offer these affordable market restricted home ownership opportunities to individuals like, you know, single mothers, young professionals, elders on fixed incomes, etc. These are folks that might not otherwise be able to afford a home within that particular neighborhood. So this is one of the last pieces of that puzzle, is to enable the below market units. And while that below market unit without government intervention might only be, let's say, 10% below market at the beginning, because it's held through a covenant, it actually becomes increasingly affordable over time. So the sooner we start to put these types of models in place, the greater the amount of housing, affordable housing options we'll see in our province. So if those are our large policy recommendations, it's, I think, beneficial to note that we aren't alone on this. We're seeing broad interest from local planning communities across the province that are working alongside us. So, and we're not talking that that gentle density is just a solution for urban centers. In fact, we're seeing communities like Nelson and Kelowna and Kimberley and Quesnel, all taking steps towards rethinking and reimagining how their single detached neighborhoods evolve to accommodate more housing options for a greater number of households. I think another thing that's really interesting to see is how important this actually is to the public. We recently undertook some polling, a province-wide polling in actually February of this year, so hot off the press. What we have found is that, you know, 73% of British Columbians say they're concerned about access to affordable housing. This is quite a substantive number, because typically issues are much more polarized than this, and even on, you know, climate change, you may not see greater than 50%. So this shows the widespread support for that. But it goes further. Actually, the majority, or 71% of respondents, say they agree that infill housing in single detached neighborhoods can help address the housing crisis, which is really, I think, a substantive number. I don't know that we would have seen that 20 years ago. So this is changing attitudes in British Columbia as it relates to how we use our single detached neighborhoods. And then, in fact, in this poll, over a fifth of homeowners across urban areas say they'd consider building a small secondary home. So for those planners in the room, think about those communities that you're in and what 1/5 of the single detached neighborhoods, what that could result in terms of housing options. Maybe a last one to leave you with that's important to think about is that it's not just urban centers. In fact, actually, 33%, so a third, a higher number of individuals said that in rural communities, they would consider building a small secondary home on their property in the next 5 years. So this gives you a sense of the depth and breadth of these types of solutions and how they can be applied across the province. So that's our just an overview of our policy solutions as they relate to gentle density. But what I want to do is start to have a discussion with Jake and Tamara about bring them into the conversation about some of their thoughts. And before I start that, I want to just make sure and encourage you to ask a number of questions. So start to feel that you can put forward some of the questions into the chat. I'm going to stop sharing for a second here. And we'll move into some of the questions. So maybe Jake, I'll start with you and just ask you a question really about why are we looking at this from a province-wide approach as opposed to a local government approach? And sort of what in your experience would have you say that now is the time to actually look more province-wide rather than municipality by municipality?
Okay, thanks, Akua. Can I just make sure the audio is working? Everyone can hear us? It's great. Okay, well, I think there's three key points that I would really want to focus about why we want to take more of a province-wide approach. And one is that, you know, I think if we want to make an impact in this, we really have to look at this as a more of a regional lens. You know, we've looked at the successes that we've seen in our neighboring states. That this has been a theme, you know, when we're looking at what works and doesn't work. That regional approach is so important. And in part, one is I think we're all, as people who are interacting with regulatory bodies and communities, there's only so much bandwidth, and the opportunity to us to collectively look at what we can come up with umbrella policies and be able to take kind of a shared approach about what's going to work and not what's going to work and what's not going to work, and be able to kind of to have our resources used more effectively is really important. And I think the other one is that the idea in that regional approach is also not to be prescriptive, that something specific has to happen and dictated from a province down approach about what a neighborhood has to look at, but it's to come up with a set of tools that communities can use and really base their work from. So, you know, having both our organization and association with the groups that we're pulling together to do some of the heavy lifting collectively, which allows the bandwidth for specific communities to be able to really cater what they need in their communities. And I think that's really fundamentally what we want to look at. And not to go on a tangent, but I think we can't lose sight too that, you know, when we look at our communities, we're only so many decades old. And a lot of the pressures that we had outlined that we're facing now were really pressures that people were facing in those inceptions of these communities. So we're trying to utilize the same approach. How are we going to deal with this? How are we going to use our cities and the land masses in those cities to create more equity for the populations of those cities? And I think we need that broader lens and broader approach to really have the most successful approach.
Thanks so much, Jake. That's great. Great. I think that's actually going to touch on some of other questions too. What I'll do is I'll ask Tamara one additional question, and then we'll start to move to the Q&A. So Tamara, really, we're looking to catalyze a whole new development community, the homeowner developer. So if these recommendations were put in place tomorrow, what pace and scale of development could we expect? And what barriers might still exist to action?
Yeah, well, I guess first I'd like to say that it's not necessarily a whole new community of developers, because historically that's so much of how housing supply has been generated. It's been family based, and so I don't think we necessarily need to look at it as a completely new thing. But we are seeing that, you know, as these types of policy changes have come forward for the scale of development, it's been leading to incremental development and really incremental change. And as long as the upzoning extends to a broad geographic area and not just a small portion of properties and not just along, say, a single corridor, then really a dispersed pattern of new development can be expected, with gentle increases in housing supply sort of popping up among neighborhoods. But as you noted, there are still barriers to getting new supply built, even if you have really great enabling policy and regulation in place. Homeowner education is absolutely essential to introduce these opportunities for homeowners to redevelop their properties. And our traditional lenders, our banks, especially our credit unions, really do need to be brought along. They can do a better job of offering financing products that will really fit the specific needs of homeowner developers. And then the final note that I would add here is that our construction sector also needs to be supported with additional training to bring them into the gentle density space so that they can realize the opportunity with this type of development. And our organization, Small Housing, is definitely working on addressing some of these gaps. And we're looking for partners. We want to be convening stakeholders to be addressing these challenges together.
Great. Great. And I'm noticing some great examples and great questions in the chat. So let's actually work through some of them and start with you, Tamara, on one of them. Really going back to that first recommendation around strata. And as many of you are starting to note that those three recommendations, some of them also bleed together. So that path model, for instance, would likely require strata title as well. So maybe, do you have any examples of enabling regulation from local governments for stratification of ADUs?
Sure. So we should all keep our eyes peeled for what's happening in Edmonton, where they will be coming forward with condominiumization or stratification regulations that would allow for backyard cottages to be held under their own title. And I think that they've really tapped into this idea and understood that if you want to enable this new supply, you need to provide homeowners with more than just the potential of a trickle in of rental income. You need to offer them with the sales revenue available at the end of producing that new home. And a lot of people aren't set up for being landlords. It's not for everyone, and especially not for older couples who are, say, downsizing. They might not want to add the additional risk or responsibility of having to be a landlord as well. So that stratification option clearly has some great benefits. So keep your eyes peeled for Edmonton. Also look down to California. There's some great examples there. There was statewide legislation passed for lot splitting and duplexing of each of those separate lots. So 4 titles created out of a single lot. So there's a number of good examples.
Great. And maybe on that, Jake, like in your experience, your company has developed over 300 laneway homes. What's the interest that you've noted from homeowners that you've worked with, and why they were wanting to pursue strata title?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And to step back a bit, I mean, we do see strata titling pretty frequent in the Lower Mainland, often associated with heritage retention, and we see that in Victoria too. So these are projects where there's some incentive for creating protection of a building. And I think one of the things that was really interesting to reflect on is that what we're seeing most frequently and what we've identified tends to be, it is that homeowner who's overhoused, they may be out of the workforce. They themselves aren't in a position, nor do they have a lot of options of where they might move to, but this becomes an opportunity for them to stay in place, reinforce the community that they love, and at the same time start to accommodate some housing for people who want to be in that community. And the idea of, for lack of a better term, sort of giving up or releasing the equity that might be in their backyard for a small financial gain. And I think the one thing I could really see a route forward, just from our experience and those dozens of homes that we built, is that a lot of times people don't want to change their principal residence. When we look at those heritage properties that I first referenced, they tend to be, there's 1 or 2 walls left of a property, and the whole property has been redeveloped, because financially that's what makes it a viable project. So you're starting with a property, it's been purchased on a speculative front, almost the whole building's been raised to then put in 3 or 4 suites, which go on the market for quite a bit of money, and in the Vancouver area up to $1,700 or even $1,800 a square foot. What we're looking at is, if you had somebody who doesn't want to change that principal residence, isn't making any changes to the home, and it's just taking an infill, working with a builder to make a modest infill, which then would go on the market, it has a couple of things. One is it's fulcrumed on the land at the current value. It's not a speculative venture where people are looking to get money off the land in addition to funds off the building. So this is where we really see that this is how we start to potentially get some really attainable housing that starts to just repopulate neighborhoods, which themselves have been depleting in the number of people per household.
Great. So one of the questions that we had on here, Jake, and I'll stick to you before sort of pivoting back to Tamara, was really around what's the what's the golden kind of nugget ticket of what would bylaw be that would enable gentle density? I know you've had experience working with the city of Vancouver, where there's been a great amount of uptake, but maybe let's speak to sort of what ones work. What have you seen that really allows that or enables it, and where maybe that has not taken place?
Yeah, I think if we were to look at that, I think the one thing that really made Vancouver's program as successful as it was initially on the onset was just the fact that, again, going back to that sense of land value and how challenging it was to be housing, and the fact that people were starting to be able to produce homes. I do think the one regulatory change that probably made the biggest difference was the parking relaxation and dropping the cars per household down. That's really what facilitated making the structures that were going to be built in the laneways, replacing garages, really viable. They didn't, and it's well known that, and in fact, there were some even ad hoc surveys done, but well over 50% of garages aren't even housing cars, they're housing stuff. And so the idea that we could actually, by having an exterior parking stall and having this residential unit, we were actually increasing off-site parking, or on-site parking, I should say. So I think that was a big driver. And I think the other part on a regulatory one, as we relook at this equation, I really think the most successful thing we can do, which doesn't have a great deal of risk, is to start to look at, if that principal residence doesn't change use, if it's not changing, that we don't look to extract a bevy of upgrades on the principal residence. We allow that to exist as compliant to code, and that we look at that, energy performance and building code issues really being focused on only on the new structure.
Thanks, Jake, for that. That's helpful. Tamara, we have a question about, back to sort of the applicability of these types of housing in smaller communities, specifically actually under 10,000 people. So what types of examples do we know of gentle density solutions taking place in smaller or more rural communities?
Sure. Well, I can't necessarily speak to small communities that have already applied the policy recommendations that we're proposing here. However, just in BC, we have some great examples of municipalities that are really stepping up and are, some of them quite ahead of their times, and are really implementing some great enabling policy. Kimberley comes to mind with some really strong mid-higher density zoning already in place across the whole community. Nelson comes to mind with their laneway housing program, including sample home designs. Cumberland comes to mind with a bunch of great work happening there. Gibson's as well, I know, is revamping some of their garden suite strategy. So there's lots of great examples across BC, really small planning departments with very few planning staff that are just doing amazing jobs of advancing this work. And if we look to Oregon, California, Washington, there's so many other examples there as well. So depending on what specific information you're looking for, we can certainly help you try to find some policy precedents that might be able to support the work that you're doing. And that is part of the body of work that Small Housing is setting out to do this year, is providing some more case studies, so that case studies of successful initiatives in both BC and abroad, so that we have some more references to rely on as we're introducing these concepts to our councils and to our public of where it really has already been well vetted, implemented, and successful.
Great. I'm going to stick with you, Tamara, and just ask you another question right now around the ways that homeowners finance the construction costs. And again, we know that that's a barrier in BC, but what are the examples or interesting ideas that we can learn from communities outside of maybe BC that have tackled this financing of the construction costs? Yeah, I want to take that.
Sure. So Jake, maybe I can ask you to tag team this one with me. But yes, the homeowner financing piece is a big piece of the puzzle. So we know that we need to be working with our lending institutions, our banks, and credit unions to create some better products that are tailored for this market. We really want homeowners to have the opportunity to leverage their land or leverage their land and home and make those available for their construction financing. From what I understand, some of these processes have already been in place, but sort of in a case-by-case basis, and it just hasn't become sort of these like mainstream products that would be available and marketed. Van City's Mixer Mortgage, which has recently come out, has some interesting potential to be applied within the missing middle space. And then in terms of south of the border, we see some great programs that do provide additional financing opportunities for marginalized homeowners of marginalized population to be able to access different funding pots to help support development of ADUs in their backyard. So some great examples coming out of California for that. And then Jake, I don't know if you wanted to address this a bit more with what you know from working with homeowners here in the BC context.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things to expand on that too, and all really good points, Tamara. I think there's two things. One is an umbrella comment that I'd like to make is I think that what we're looking to do in these discussions is really to open up this potential for people. And as much as I personally, just from my experience, think it'll be very successful, would have a really meaningful impact on the housing demand. It is also something which we generated out of that homeowner. This is going to be a tool or an opportunity that someone could take advantage of. And the program will succeed or not, and we'll have not a huge amount of risk, because what we've identified is this is really something which is predicated on someone having equity in their property. This is not going to stimulate a speculative industry. There's just not the financial incentives there to do that. This is really mom and pop working with a builder or a small developer or a company like ours who might start to specialize in this. And we see that as a kind of a fostering the industry, much like Akua talked about had happened in California. I mean, some of the interesting things that are available is if strata-title is available, all of a sudden a homeowner, even if they're stretched financially or they don't have the resources just to go out and get a line of credit, which some people very well may be able to do if they have a lot of equity in their property, they're going to be able to all of a sudden use that land. There's going to be less risk in this, and it's going to be more opportunities for that building community, which is currently just doing single family homes, to start to partner with these single family owners. And I think that's the gem of this idea, is that it's one of those small initiatives that could have a really big impact. And the threshold around financing will have its challenges, but I think we'll see financial institutions react to that, especially things such as more community-based banks like Van City. But I think at the same time, there's going to be more conduits for people to do this on an individual basis and be able to react to their personal or their financial situation and adapt to find different routes forward. And it's out of that, I think, we'll find the strength of the program in general.
Thanks, Jake. I'm actually going to stick with you then, Akshay, and ask you to maybe about, the permanently attainable home ownership model, and we developed that several years ago, and we've continued to see land and housing really increase. So do the pro formas proving out the concept from a financial standpoint still net out? Have we done any updates that make sure that it's still valid based on kind of current construction costs, approval fees, etc.?
I'm going to say, well, there's the short answer is yes, it still works, and that's the great part of it. I mean, 100%, even this last 6 months with what's been going on with interest rates and so forth, make this a somewhat of a moving target. When we last looked at this, going back about a year ago, we found it worked super well in Kelowna. We felt that it would really work there. Somewhere like Nelson, it didn't work as well, but it didn't work as well because, and my interpretation of what we had done is that we weren't necessarily facing a threshold around pricing. We were facing a threshold around available stock. So in doing these models, there was the opportunity to create more housing stock for people to acquire. And in that context, that multiplex type of approach would really start to have a meaningful impact on providing more housing units. But we weren't so focused on attainability. Kelowna worked really well. Somewhere like Coquitlam didn't work as well because there wasn't a relaxation in the sort of CACs or the amenity that the town, the municipalities were looking to extract off the project. If we look at Vancouver, which is probably where when we initially did our first feasibility study going back to, I think it was 2017 or so, the numbers still work. The challenge, to be very candid, is that we're just going to get one unit just a little below market. We're not going to get what we had hoped, which was a much more robust lower number below market. But as it's been brought up in this conversation, getting that property in, or that one unit at a 5% today, gets us something that's going to be 20% below market in a foreseeable future, be it 10 or even 15 years at the most. But I think those are the important parts. And then I think the other part, which I really feel is worth noting, is that as we roll this out, I really think the nice thing about that, having the structure where we proposed about having a negative covenant on title, really allows certain municipalities to start to look at this being a self-regulating program. I mean, there will be thresholds that would have to be met with real estate professionals, but it's not necessarily having to set up an agency to manage this. And I think that's something that, as we develop this and continue to test the viability of it, I think that's something that's going to be very important, that, we're not burdening a smaller community like Vernon, let's say, or Terrace, with having to set up something to monitor the use of these houses. I think we can come up with a legal structure which allows that to be self-regulating.
Great, thank you, Jake. So that's a bit of an overview of that, the financial requirements to make this type of affordable housing model work without government intervention. Caveat there too. So we know that there are other elements that are required for that. And so I want to go to another question from Brian, where he's asked this whole idea of the sixplex with the below market unit, which is likely a strata, yes. The management of one strata unit by an experienced social entity is not a simple relationship. Are there any models where this is happening and that we can draw on? So Tamara, I'm just going to ask you to maybe speak to some examples that you may have seen.
Sure. So I don't have any great examples to bring up, but I do know that these models of what would be considered sort of a scattered site affordable housing trust have been tried out in various jurisdictions, and particularly in Northern Europe, there are some examples of it. And there was some talk out east of developing this as well. And we do have great examples of affordable home ownership kind of oversight entities, Whistler Housing Authority being a great one. So when you marry sort of a light touch oversight entity with a well laid out set of strata bylaws, you should be able to find a good marriage there. In order to have that one unit that's going to be held below market, have some level of oversight on it, and still be able to interact well with the other strata units within that strata corporation. So I wish I had some more great examples for you, but I don't have them at the fingertip.
Thanks, Tamara. I'll maybe pivot to answer a question really about public attitudes around gentle density. And we have a question related to sort of the public's reaction to the statewide housing densification in the US and sort of what resulted from that. What was interesting in the California context, and I can maybe speak to this, was that the statewide policy was actually enabled by a huge groundswell of support from a coalition called the Casita Coalition. And they brought together not only homeowner associations, but the retirees associations, affordable housing providers, industry, a really diverse cross-section of stakeholders coming together to advocate and support this type of housing. And that is one of the reasons that they were able to move and advance this type of initiative. What they've seen since then is just actually increased support from homeowners. So one of the last slides that I showed, I didn't speak to this, but there was most recently significant polling done where 73% approved of the ADU policies. in the state of California. It speaks to both, I would say, it doesn't necessarily have a political spectrum as you would see maybe with other issues. It's one that both sides of the political spectrum can see benefits from. And because of that is a great example. I'd say in the Canadian context, and this is interesting, one of the very first pieces of research we undertook at Small Housing BC was to look at some of the first laneway homes that were built. And maybe Jake, do you want to speak to some of the results of that and the attitudes around from the public that emerged?
Yeah, it was really interesting. So to give it context, there was a few years in, there had been about 300 laneway homes, and we had engaged the Mistel group. In fact, that was the first thing Small Housing BC did. It was our first study. And we had had the 9 direct neighbors interviewed for the first 300, and we had a really quite robust comeback. I think when I look at the most positive responses, because anyone who knows me knows I'm this pathological optimist, but the most meaningful ones was that about 30% after a laneway house had been in situ for about 6 months, 30% of the neighbors wanted to, or were considering or wanted to build a laneway house. So it really spoke to how once we saw these up and entered into the community, how quickly even the direct neighbors began to accept it. The other part I thought was really interesting was that, of course, the onset, the biggest concern was what's going to happen around parking. And there was a big concern around parking and what that would do to disturb sort of daily life. And I will say it was interesting, 6 months later, 3 years later, for some of these people, it was still a concern. But when asked, had it become an impact, the answer was no. So it's that interesting kind of dance of what becomes acceptable in a community, and clearly these sort of smaller impact developments can be taken up. And I think that's really probably the takeaway for me was that it really became quite an interesting discussion around for people where they really wanted to take advantage of this for themselves. And I think that was the biggest. I think the biggest thing that seeded the success of this program was the fact that this became an opportunity that someone could take up for themselves to improve, for lack of a better term, their sort of family life. I mean, where we sit right now, we're just a little over 350 homes built. Well into the high 80% of that tends to be for people looking to accommodate something to do with a multi-generational family. And I think that's, even when we look at strata-titling, I think it would have been even more prolific than that had that option existed. And yet what we'd see in the community really wouldn't function any differently.
Thanks, Jake. We're coming near the end of our time together. So, well, first of all, on the piece of the public opinion, if you're interested in learning more about these types of topics, the Gentle Density Network is a community that you should join, especially if you're a planner and you want to access greater levels of resources around this. So there'll be a number of other sessions that are upcoming that are going to dive into these very types of questions that you've posed here, not only around infrastructure requirements, public opinion in British Columbia on gentle density, financing solutions. All of these are part of our slate of webinars that are upcoming this year. Maybe a quick answer to one last question here from Mark around the province-wide gentle density mechanism. And yes, sort of akin to the step code, there would be a first step that's set as a requirement for all municipalities, with the ability of individual jurisdictions to opt in to higher steps based on their own housing commitments and pace and scale of development. That is clear. That is part of the vision that we have. I know we haven't been able to get to everybody's questions. We're noting them, and the best we can, we will reach back out and respond to those that we can. I do want to maybe also take a minute. If there's any last, I'll do a little round with Jake and Tamara for any sort of last last comments that you want to leave people thinking about today. Then we'll open up a few last polling questions from all of you. Okay. Go ahead, Tamara.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add one last piece that kind of touches on that intersection between public perception and affordability. So I think that some concern has been raised about whether ADUs, new ADU production would actually manage to achieve any significant level of affordability on its own. And just looking to the south, our example of California at present, on average, ADUs are occupied by households that are at 80% of the area median income. So, 10 years plus into policy being established and supply being generated, regulations being lifted, just the natural increase in supply and allowing households and families to support their other family members means that naturally, these units are being made available at affordable rates for our middle income earners. So just wanted to leave everyone with that thought.
Great. Jake, go ahead.
Well, I think it's such a great point Tamara brings up. I want to build on that too, which is that I think we're in a situation province-wide where land has become such a kind of a fulcrum around acquisition and wealth building. I think this is one of the mechanisms where we've sort of hit a wall, when we look at how does our local community actually exist on this land, which in a great extent has been it's stuck in this kind of investor commodity situation. And I think what we're talking about is this is how we're going to release the land. This is how we create equity in our communities. It's to start to allow that land to be broken up. And while we may not be able to get high ends of affordability, we're going to have a big impact on attainability. We're going to start to get those firefighters and teachers and people who are key to our communities to be able to live in our communities. And I think this is the key to it. And this is a pretty risk-free program. I mean, we're going to be able to have it roll out as it's successful to the community. This isn't being imposed. This is just an option people can take up. And I think it's important that we reflect on that this will work as it works, as opposed to being forced on something and failing or succeeding arbitrarily.
Thanks, Jake. That's great. Okay, we're going to be moving into some polls, which are basically going to have you assess both this session and also our policy prescriptions. We want to keep pushing these and working alongside local governments and provinces to enable this. So the more we hear from you, the better. You're going to see a couple polls pulled up here before you leave to share your opinions, and that'll allow us to build out our work in a way that it better reflects the needs and interests you have. And thanks again for staying tuned, for being so active in the Q&A and on the chat. We're really excited to reconvene again soon to continue this dialogue. Thank you, everyone. So just before you do, feel free to fill that out and then enjoy the rest of your day. This is where I need my Jeopardy music or something like that going. All right. Okay, thank you for participating and sharing your feedback on the polls. And we hope to see you all again soon. Take care.
Thanks for joining us.